I had a perfect video planned out. I would 3D print over £1,000 worth of models, some almost extinct in the wild, with ELEGOO's latest printer, a Mars 5 Ultra that has been made specifically for beginners. Within 3 hours, I had broken the test model in two, cured half a tub of resin into the world's most expensive pickle jar, and it looked like I had bricked the entire machine just by pressing the wrong button. Then something happened, and suddenly I was literally printing money, £200 to £300 per print. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Like the vast majority of the world's population, I'd never used one of these before, and they scared me. After all, I'm just a regular human who is trying to avoid a doctor listing misadventure under their cause of death. But this is a 3D printer that has been built for beginners like me. So, is 3D printing easy now? Full stop. Or is 3D printing easy, comma, if you know how, ... pause for dramatic effect. A few words before we begin. ELEGOO reached out to me and gave me a Mars 5 Ultra, a wash and cure machine, a couple of bottles of resin and a tub of detergent. They haven't encouraged me to say anything particular about their product apart from some tags and affiliate links. And after watching other reviews of these machines by Warhammer, Uncle Jesse, Rising Ape and Elevated Systems amongst others, it's clear that ELEGOO are perfectly happy to have reviewers say pretty much whatever they like when talking about their products. My general feelings on 3D printing even before opening the packaging were apathetic, leaning towards slightly negative. I believe that the 3D printer goes burr comments I read whenever Games Workshop announces a price rise is the 2020s version of those guys from the Bud Light What's commercial, and reading them made me want to make my first 3D print a working crossbow. Despite this, you need not fear, I will be subjecting this product to my usual journalistic integrity, probity, judiciousness, and moral turpitude. So, first things first, what do you even want to print? A sensible person would download a nice tester model from someone like One Page Rules to show off the crisp edges of the Mars 5 Ultra. However, I have no interest in actually owning a model from One Page Rules. Buying a 3D printer to print knockoff Space Marines is like buying a Rolls Royce and using the Spirit of Ecstasy on the bonnet to open the top of your beer. However, if you look deeper on the internet, you come across the really good stuff. I recently fell down a rabbit hole searching for the High Elf sculpts to start an era-appropriate 1993 High Elf army, but I came unstuck almost immediately. The supply has pretty much dried up. In fact, the only way to buy certain models was to buy sealed vintage product rather than the usually cheaper second-hand painted miniatures. This was a surprise for me, as I've seen the scale of metal recasters on eBay for a long time, working to ensure that more Praetorian Imperial Guardsmen exist than could ever have been created for their limited release in 1998. However, there is still one thing that remains out of reach of recasters, and those are the plastic mini sprues that went with some old models. Long story cut short, in the 90s, certain models had metal bodies, but the arms and weapons were plastic because metal was relatively easy and cheap to cast, while plastic sprues were lighter and easier to work with, but more expensive to produce, as you had to cut the molds out of steel plate. However, when people got their hands on the second-hand models, the metal parts could be quite easily salvaged by giving the model a bath in Dettol, but any plastic parts that were welded together with polystyrene cement would be almost impossible to reclaim. That means that eBay has a suspiciously vast amount of metal tactical Space Marines with no arms or backpacks for surprisingly cheap, but yet a very small amount of the accompanying plastic sprues to go with them. The shoulder pad, backpack and bolt gun sprue goes for £15 by itself. The arm sprue with 6 sets of arms goes for about £20. And a mint 1992 Space Marine weapon sprue goes for an eye-watering £30 a pop. So if you want a nice 2nd edition tactical squad, it's going to set you at about £100 just for the plastic parts. If you want a full assault squad all armed with power swords, that's £60 for the arms and then £300 for the weapons. So that's a cool £5,000 for the parts to build just 2 squads. However, step in some unnamed hobbyist who appears to have access to a high quality digital scanner, and suddenly those parts exist in a digital form. And that's not all I found, but we'll get back to that later. The only problem is that I now have to actually work out how to use a 3D printer. 3D printing is absolutely terrifying. I watched many YouTube videos on this subject before starting. Unfortunately, the majority of them cater to people who know the difference between a FEP sheet and an exposure test, because 3D printers are usually reviewed by people who use 3D printers on a weekly basis. But what about people who have never 3D printed anything? I wanted to approach this project like an absolute beginner would. After all, you can only be a beginner once, and then you lose that perspective. Could I just plug one of these in, follow some simple instructions, and get decent results? Let's find out. The Mars 5 Ultra is 11 inches by 10 inches and 18 inches high with a little Wi-Fi antenna poking out the side. If you don't have a tape measure to hand, the footprint of this on a desk is almost exactly the same as a box of Animal Crossing Lego, specifically Isabelle's house. But in reality, the dimensions of these objects isn't as relevant as you might think, because you need at least 4 foot worth of table space for the extra kit, and you need a lot of extra kit. I bought all of the extra equipment that I was told by the experts on YouTube that I needed, including a couple of excellent on-brand tea trays. I plugged in the USB stick, power adapter and Wi-Fi antenna, and everything worked okay. It did a little self-test after booting up. I peeled all the safety plastic off, inserted the build plate in, screwed the resin vat in place, and set the machine up to work on my Wi-Fi. It downloaded the firmware updates straight away. It restarted twice for some reason. I poured this water washable resin into the container and hit print on the little Rook test piece. The screen said that it was going to take 1 hour 40 minutes, and as the machine started whirring, I plugged my air quality monitor in and went for a walk, confident that this device would perform correctly and that I would print all the retro miniature parts I liked forever and ever and ever and ever. I returned wearing my stylish respirator and full PPE, which was just as well, as the lady in the air quality monitor was wailing with the terrifying robotic cadence of the sirens at Chernobyl. I had left my window on the safety latch, which clearly wasn't enough. Luckily, I set this up in a room where I can fully crack the window open to give myself 3 square feet of exposure to the outside, and with the assistance of a fan, I managed to get the room to safe levels in about 10 minutes. Then, I tried to get the test model off of the build plate. It was welded on as if it had been superglued. There was no edge that I could use to pry or get an angle to it, and in desperation, I snapped it in two. After many long minutes of gouging and prying, I finally managed to release it. There is no troubleshooting guide in the book, so of course I went to the internet to work out what the issue was. The Google box told me that I needed to adjust something called the base exposure time. In order to stick the models to the build plate, these first layers need extra UV exposure. So I went into the printer. I found what I thought was the UV exposure setting and promptly ended up printing the logo of ELEGOO directly into the bottom of my vat. I poured the resin out into a spare pickle jar temporarily and spent 45 minutes cleaning that logo up with the plastic spatula included, only to realise that due to the sun's position at that time of day, it had been shining onto the jar and had cured the whole jar solid. Okay, let's pause for a moment to consider this. I know with gut-wrenching certainty there are people ready in the comments to tell me that I'm an idiot, and only an idiot would make that kind of mistake. And they are right. I did it all wrong. But in my client's defense, Your Honor, this machine is advertised to be an ideal beginner machine, and I wanted to experience this as a beginner, or as much of a beginner as I could be. I did enough research in this field to know what extra equipment I needed to buy beforehand, because I didn't want to be left without a key component midway through. But aside from that, I let the menus and user interface guide me through the process. In hindsight, I now know that as soon as I saw that the tank had something in the bottom of it, I should have placed the remains of the Rook in the bottom of the tank, run a 15-second tank cleaning process, and peel a thin film of resin out of the pool of goo, removing the error print in seconds, as shown here. But I didn't, because I was a beginner. Instead, I genuinely thought I had bricked the entire machine. Not only had I just broken a printer, but rendered useless several £100 of extra equipment. The days of prep work and thousands of words of script I'd already written were useless. It was over. The channel would die. I'd have to go back to my career as a B-movie extra playing Maimed Dead Body number 5. Luckily, the parts of my brain that deal with failure and despair no longer function correctly, along with my short-term memory and the parts that govern my bowel movements. So I just cleared the tank up manually with a plastic scraper and got on with the next step. The next day, I came back to the machine to try an exposure test to try and tweak the settings to get super high quality prints, and it didn't go well. So this printer has a feature where you can partition the screen to give various different exposure times, and so dial down the exact exposure setting you need for your purposes. Too much exposure, then your models look fat and bloated as extra resin is cured into the details. Too little exposure, and those details just don't print properly in the first place. You can print a little block of 4, 6 or 8 of the same file and pick the exposure time that gives you the best result. The only trouble is pretty much everything. First of all, despite the USB stick that came with the printer being loaded with an entire chess set's worth of STL files, you can't print them because they need to be sliced first. Secondly, these files are just chess pieces. They can't really be used as an exposure test. Ideally, you need a special exposure test file, so I found one, an Amerilabs Town test print. I downloaded it, sliced it, and sent it to the machine. I loaded it in, tools, swipe, resin calibration, click confirm, confirm, and we're off to the races. I monitored it with the inbuilt camera, which was just as well, because I had spotted something that had gone wrong within 30 minutes. It had just printed the file as is, not in the configuration I needed. It turns out you need to position the file on the build plate to match the type of test you're running. So I went back. I sliced the file up to what I assumed was the rough dimensions of the exposure test area and set it running again. And when I returned, my 6 exposure test cities were now 4 test cities. The missing 2 were sitting in a puddle at the bottom of my tank, and the touchscreen had frozen. To be fair to the machine, the 4 that printed came out looking really well. So well, in fact, that I'm not sure if the different exposure settings actually did anything. Also, because the display shows the exposure file in portrait format and the print comes out in landscape format, I wasn't sure if I was missing test 1 or 5 or test 3 or 6. So I did what any reasonable adult would do at this point. I set the settings to what I thought was about right and chucked a block of 12 models through. And after a couple of hours, I got a plate with 6 of those models back. 1/2 of the prints had failed. Even worse, the first file of the day I'd printed had left a stain on the bottom of the tank that I hadn't noticed. At this point, I was midway through my second day of using this machine. The spare room, the room I use for recording these videos, was out of action and smelling like a chemical shed, and I have an expensive paperweight filled with cured toxic waste on my desk. So I had to break my own rules. I had to cheat. I called in a professional. Archie's Forge was available, fortunately, to come round and get me unstuck. This absolute hobby champion taught me how to clean the tank. He taught me about the prying technique you need to employ to break the vacuum seal between the model and the build plate, and critically, he very kindly set up a new profile for the printer with his very own printing preferences, turning on several settings like anti-aliasing that I didn't even know about. This whirlwind tour took about half an hour, and after he left, I sent a new file through to the machine. And just like that, I started printing money. I was making it rain, son. So, while I was searching for the full set of classic 1992 Space Marine arms and shoulder pads, I stumbled upon a full out-of-production Chaos Dwarf army in digital STL form. For a connoisseur of plastic models, this is the equivalent of someone throwing you the keys to a classic Ferrari F40 and saying give it a whirl. Metal Chaos Dwarf sculpts are often thought of as a holy grail. They were released once in the early 90s just before the juggernaut of 2nd edition Warhammer 40,000 came out, and then they just vanished, either not being popular or just being dwarfed, pun intended, by a more popular product released at the same time. If you're in the hobby of collecting things, you probably know that the rarest models are the ones that almost no one buys upon release, but people somehow still know about. If you saw Return of the Jedi on release, then went into a shop but somehow skipped past Darth Vader and instead picked up Bib Fortuna or FX7, those are big money these days. So your basic Chaos Dwarf infantry models come in at between £15 and £20 each, even painted and in a unit. A Bull Centaur by itself will clock in at £30 a model. And remember, those prices don't include shields. That's another plastic sprue that is long out of production. But with a 3D printer, the question isn't so much can you print them, it's how many you print in one go. And after Archie's Forge helped out, within 2 hours, out came a full plate of blunderbusses. That's £150. Plus, they came off the build plate easier with the new twisting technique. This is a plate with 2 bolt throwers and 50 or so shields. That's £70 per bolt thrower, and let's call it £1 for each shield if you wanted the old ones. This is a plate with 9 characters, both heroes, a sorcerer, and 2 full command sections. On a conservative estimate, this is a total of £270. I printed a plate with a bull Taurus and a mounted sorcerer. That's something you can really only do with 3D printing, because I'm using the monster from one kit and the rider from another. Then I jammed all 6 hobgoblin characters into the spare spaces. That's £120 per monster and £20 per hobgoblin. Plus all of these trays took between 1 hour 45 minutes for the warriors or slightly under 3 hours for the larger kits like the wings of the bull Taurus and the vertical sprues. And then I got the big one. The absolute best value print I managed was 19 Chaos Dwarf warriors. At £15 to £20 each, at the high end, I would value this at nearly £400 on the secondary market. So, you're probably doing the maths in your head right now. 6 of these models weigh about 19 grams. That's 3.16 grams each. 1,000 grams of the resin come to £23.99p. 4 pence per hour electricity costs for a couple of hours. That means it only cost me 18 pence a model, rounded up to 20 pence with the supports. Oh my god, this is it. I'm going to have virtually free miniatures for the rest of my life. I'm taking my hobby off the grid. Sell all the stock. Games Workshop is going to zero. They are as dead as disco. Well, you might have guessed by now there are quite a few caveats to this process. First of all, price and value are illusionary concepts. Although this printer has saved me money from buying parts on the second-hand market, these models are worth nothing. Legally selling these isn't so much a grey area, it's a big black area with a giant red X in the middle of it. These designs are the property of Games Workshop. I can't sell them, I can't even give them away. Not even to my Ko-fi subscribers. I would love to reward these brave souls for supporting the channel with all these prints I just made, but legally it's a non-starter. Secondly, a £20 Chaos Dwarf Axeman on eBay is worth £20 because he is a metal Chaos Dwarf Axeman, and that is what the market will pay for a metal Chaos Dwarf Axeman, even if he is a recast made in a shed somewhere. I have created a model with different materials, and even if I could sell this legally, which I could not, so could everyone else, and so the market would quickly become a race to the bottom. Plus we have to talk about the cost for the machine and its use. A Mars 5 Ultra costs £290. A 1 kilogram bottle of water washable resin costs £23.99p. A 5 kilogram bottle of cleaning detergent costs £37.99. The detergent can be skipped as the resin is water washable. ELEGOO sent it to me and recommended its use, however Archie's Forge recommends the non-water washable resin anyway. The Mercury X washing and curing station bundle costs £130.99, which I absolutely recommend, by the way. It is incredibly useful if you are doing any 3D printing. This comes to £482.97p, but that's not all, because the respirator was £20 with either A1 or A2 filters. The tea trays were 2 for £7, the 2 pickle jars were £15, and a box of gloves was £5. I got 6 safety goggles for £8, but I actually recommend a full safety visor that totally covers your face instead. A small plug-in electric heater was £10, although your need for one might vary. The air quality monitor was £90. I know you're going to be considering skipping this or getting a cheaper one, but it needs to check the air for volatile organic compounds, TVO, and formaldehyde, HCHO, if your ventilation process isn't up to scratch like mine originally wasn't. A sexy oldendemon branded apron is also available, by the way, which would save yourself from any stains on your t-shirt or trousers. So that's around £150 extra, bringing us up to around £650 all in. But remember that several of these items are consumables. The resin, the cleaning detergent, the kitchen paper, and the gloves. You go through a lot of gloves, by the way. You are going to have to rebuy them as you go. Plus, Chitubox the slicer. The slicer comes in a basic free state or a pro version, and the Mars 5 Ultra doesn't work on the basic version as of the writing of this video. Now this might be fixed in future, or it might not be. If not, that's $15.99 a month or $135 a year. You do get 92 days free with the purchase of this machine, and Lychee Slicer is an alternative, but next week the free version of Chitubox could support it, and you can ignore this section. Archie's Forge was telling me that he actually uses both pieces of software, one for slicing and one for supporting. Basically, slicing software is complicated. Someone will write me an essay in the comments section, but I'm not going to talk about it too much here because that is literally another 20 minutes by itself. And bear in mind, there is a non-zero chance that the release film on the bottom of the tank will just tear or give out with time. The film is a consumable item with only limited uses, and when it does fail, the resin may pour straight into the guts of the machine, bricking £300 worth of kit. Or alternatively, something could get into the tank. The build plate could come straight down and crack the UV plate at the bottom of the machine. Also, speaking about resin, it's still toxic. So if you wash it in water, what you're doing there is producing toxic water. You can't put that down the sink. You either have to pay to have it disposed of or pour it into a separate tank and let it evaporate over time. Plus, this process produces fumes, so you want a spare room, garage, orangery, pool house or disused cinema room to set up your kit in. But in case you're thinking of using it in your shed or ice house, just beware that the operating temperature of a 3D printer is between 24 to 30 degrees and they will start to fail below 20 degrees. I was using this in an environment where the outside air temperature was ideal, 20 degrees, overcast and virtually wind-free, so I could have the window open all day. But too much natural light in the area you're cleaning your minis on is going to lead to a pickle jar style situation. Of course, if you are running electricity up to a room that's heated up to 25 degrees for long periods of time in the UK, it's typically a sign that you're growing a fresh crop of the old Dutch giggle grass, and when the federales knock on your door, you might want to reconsider how wise it was to avoid the cost of the latest box of Space Marines. Plus, the supports for the resin should be peeled off before the models are cured in the UV light, and they will shatter, leading to your floor being covered in half-cured resin shards. You cannot let small children or pets into this room under any circumstances. I would go so far as to say you shouldn't have pets or children in your house full stop, so keep them in the shed. All that being said, the true cost of printing models at home is actually quite tricky to work out. It's certainly not as easy as just weighing the model and dividing it against the value of the resin and calling it a day. So, would I recommend the Mars 5 Ultra? If you were a semi-experienced maker type and you had space in your life for a 3D printer, this is a 3D printer that you can get decent high-quality models in decent timeframes. Infantry scale models are ideal. If you want to print out vehicles, you might want to invest in something larger. If a genie appeared in front of me right now and let me build one of these myself, I would want it to have an overhauled user interface. And the same for the slicing software. I would want the included print file to be a resin exposure test, sliced up and ready for a 4, 6 or 8 stage exposure test. I would want an included booklet that tells you how to read your exposure file. Warhammer has made a video on how to do this exact thing. I recommend checking that out if you're interested. But for that matter, why not have a step-by-step setup and calibration procedure in the box with a bunch of QR codes that lead to a series of videos on concepts like setup, tank cleaning, removing the prints from the build plate, and things like that. I would have beginner pop-ups on this machine that tell you about each feature and what it does. I would work out a removable flexible build plate attachment that allows you to detach it and flex it to instantly detach the prints. I would not put the useless fabric face mask in the box. I wouldn't have a bunch of unsliced chest pieces on the USB stick in STL format when you can't print them directly from the machine. I would stick the Wi-Fi aerial inside the printer. I would remove the swipe interface because I'm just smearing resin onto the screen. For that matter, I would have the entire menu something you can remotely use on a computer elsewhere just in case the screen fails. I would also add a heated vat. While I was at it, you may as well. But I'm probably out of wishes at this point. Ultimately, if a genie appeared in front of me, I'd just wish for skin that wasn't the shade of a drowned corpse first, and then a Porsche, and then I'd get my files printed by someone else. Honestly, the main way you could make this machine better is if it was in the hands of someone who knew what they were doing and had the appropriate facility. But to be fair to the Mars 5 Ultra, you're not going to get an easy ride in the 3D printing hobby. These printers have a steep and brutal learning curve. If they were a game, they would be Dark Souls. Trying to review a 3D printer in 2024 is like trying to review the eggs in a cake. They function as expected, but if the flour is causing it to lose consistency and the icing is classified as toxic waste and you're lactose intolerant, what are you going to say? I'm really happy about the models I was able to print. I'm less happy about the smell that took a week to leave this room, despite a deep clean. or the jugs of liquid in the shed I'm leaving to evaporate before I can scrape the resin out of the bottom to dispose of. If I wanted more toxicity in my life, I'd reactivate my Twitter account. Please subscribe for more content, and I'll see you next time.